Welcome to the deep dive. This is the show where we take your source material, articles, data, research, and we really just distill it down.
Right, into the essential, actionable knowledge you need.
Exactly. And today, we are tackling, I think, a really fundamental question. It's one that shapes our economy and, well, our daily lives.
It's a huge one.
When did the house stop being, a home, a basic need, a reliable shelter?
And start being talked about almost exclusively as an investment.
Yeah, an investment vehicle. That's the core mission for this deep dive.
It is. For you, the listener, we're basically tracing a series of quiet, almost administrative policy shifts. This isn't a story about one big crisis.
No.
It's a structural transformation where the logic of the whole system just slowly changed. It redefined what housing is actually for.
And the evidence for that is, it's everywhere. It's in the language we use.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources all point to this. We instinctively talk about housing in performance terms now. It has to appreciate. It can underperform.
Its value must be protected.
Right. This entire lexicon, it's built on profit and return, not on providing, four walls and a roof. When did that become so normal that we just don't even register it anymore?
The sheer normalcy is maybe the most insidious part. Just think about how we talk to each other.
Okay.
If a friend says they're waiting to retire because their home equity is still going up, we get that. We understand the logic.
Or if a first-time buyer is panicking because they're afraid of missing out on more growth.
We nod. That fear isn't about being homeless. It's about missing a financial opportunity.
And this is the point that really jumped out at me from the sources, this paradox. Price increases are reported everywhere as good economic news.
Right. Celebratory headline.
Celebratory, even when we all know, often very painfully, that those same rising prices make life fundamentally harder for young families, for essential workers.
For anyone trying to get on the ladder, it's a huge tension.
So we're celebrating wealth for one group while, it has disastrous consequences for providing a basic necessity for another.
And that's the shift. That marks the quiet erosion of housing as a public outcome.
A public outcome? Okay, explain that.
Well, think back to the 1980s and 90s when the UK privatized all those major utilities.
Sure. Electricity, gas, water.
Exactly. The political argument then was that the state didn't need to own the infrastructure, the pipes and wires. Private companies could own them, but the state would regulate the system to make sure the outcome was still public.
Meaning you'd still get reliable supply, reasonable prices.
Precisely. We trusted the market to deliver the public good. Housing followed a very similar path, but much more quietly.
The idea was just let the market handle it.
Let the market handle the supply of homes, and prosperity will trickle down. But here's the problem. Unlike with utilities, the housing market actively rewards scarcity. The owner of the asset benefits directly when the supply of that asset is restricted. So the second we stopped treating housing as a collective good and started treating it like a financial asset, the incentives for scarcity just kicked right in.
Which brings us to the core question then. If a home was once seen as a basic human need, when did that idea slip into second place behind this? This need for return, for investment and profit. Let's get into the mechanics of it.
Okay, so the structural shift really begins in earnest in the early 1980s. The main policy was, of course, right to buy.
The mechanism that started moving millions of homes out of public ownership.
And it's so important to get the scale of this. This wasn't a slow trickle. It was a massive transfer, often at really steep discounts.
Sometimes up to 60% off market value, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was framed as democratic empowerment, giving people ownership. And the result was huge. Roughly 2 million council homes were sold off over time.
That is a colossal transfer of public assets into the private market.
It really is.
But the research is really clear on this. Selling the homes was only half the story. The really consequential part was that they were almost never replaced. Why? Why couldn't councils just reinvest that money and build new stock?
And that's where the policy architecture gets, pretty revealing. Local councils were heavily restricted by central government.
In what way?
Specifically around borrowing and reinvestment. So they were required to sell the homes, but they were prevented from fully using the proceeds to replace the stock.
Where did the money go?
A lot of it went back to the Treasury, and on top of that, strict borrowing limits meant they just couldn't fund new large-scale construction. They were essentially boxed in.
So you can sell off your assets, but you're kneecapped when it comes to replacing them.
That's a good way to put it. The system was structurally designed to shrink the public housing supply.
And the numbers on building rates, I mean, they just tell the whole story. Post-war, councils were building at a true scale,
Oh, absolutely. Routinely, well over 100,000 homes a year.
sometimes closer to 200,000.
Correct. Now contrast that with what happened after Right to Buy. By the 1990s and 2000s, that figure had just collapsed. We were talking about the low thousands,
Not 100,000, just a few thousand a year.
if that. In some places, you could count a year's new council bills on one hand.
Yeah.
It was a complete stop.
And all the while, the population didn't just stand still, did it?
Not at all. Through the 90s and 2000s, the demand pressure was relentless. The population kept growing by, on average, about 158,000 people a year.
And those people need somewhere to live.
Of course. And with the public rental sector shrinking so fast, it created this huge vacuum. For a little while, home ownership absorbed that demand. It peaked at around 70% in the early 2000s.
But that was a peak, right? Not sustainable.
Not without that public safety net and with prices climbing ever higher. So private renting was the only sector left to expand and fill the void. And that's how we end up with a generation that is so dependent on a private rental market.
A market that, by its very nature, views housing as an asset class, first and foremost.
Exactly.
So let's pivot to that private sector, because it grew incredibly fast. And what's interesting here is that for many people, becoming a landlord was an adaptation, wasn't it?
That's a critical nuance, yes.
The research suggests that when wages were lagging behind these soaring asset prices, owning an investment property started to look like one of the only reliable ways to get ahead.
Or just to keep pace. To provide for retirement. We shouldn't characterize every small landlord as some kind of villain. They were often just responding rationally to the system they were in.
A system that rewards holding assets more than earning wages.
But that individual adaptation had these profound collective consequences. And two major structural changes really accelerated that. First was consolidation.
What do you mean by that?
Well, those 2 million council homes that were sold didn't just end up evenly spread across 2 million new homeowners who lived in them forever.
Wait, but the policy was right to buy. Shouldn't they have stayed with the buyers?
The initial buyer often got that deep discount, lived there for a few years, and then sold it on the open market for a huge profit. And those homes often ended up in the hands of existing property investors.
Or increasingly bigger companies.
Right? Institutional investors. So the effect was that fewer owners ended up holding more and more property. Scale started to matter. We saw the rise of large-scale corporate landlords whose entire business model depends on these assets appreciating.
So it moves way beyond an individual's retirement plan and into the world of, what, quarterly return expectation.
You've got it. That immediately changes the whole conversation.
Okay, what was the second major change?
The second involves housing associations, or HAs. As councils pulled back from building, HAs grew to take on that role. And they are critical. They house millions of people.
But their funding model is totally different from the old council system.
Totally different. Old council housing answered directly to local voters. Modern HAs, while they have a social purpose, have to balance that with the strict expectations of financial markets.
Lenders, banks, bond investors.
Right. And those lenders, they aren't looking at the waiting list numbers. They're looking for reliable financial performance.
For security on their investment.
Precisely. Has rely on their credit ratings to borrow billions to keep building. They have to be efficient, minimize debt risk, ensure rents cover their obligations. So the constraints on an HA, what it can build, where it can build, are dictated by the demands of capital, not just by social need.
Which introduces a whole other layer of different pressures and different incentives, as the sources put it.
Yes.
And this all leads us to what the sources call the uncomfortable truth. This contradiction we see every day. Massive waiting lists for housing right alongside huge numbers of empty, viable property.
Or planning permission is granted for thousands of homes and then just nothing happens for years.
Land changes hands, but homes don't appear.
This phenomenon, which is often called land banking, is the most logical outcome of the investment logic we've been describing. It's the profit of inaction.
How so?
Look, if a piece of land or a property earns money just by being owned, say its value goes up 10% this year, without you doing a single thing, then waiting is profoundly rational.
Holding the asset feels sensible, profitable.
Of course. Why take the risk of building, with all the expense and hassle, when you can just wait for the price to rise even further?
And connecting that to the bigger picture, it explains why solving this seems so politically difficult, even when everyone agrees we need more supply.
It does. Limiting supply is a fundamental economic principle for pushing up asset prices. So in this system, not building isn't necessarily a mistake.
It's a strategy.
It's an effective, rational strategy for protecting existing asset values. Holding back supply ensures that scarcity premium stays high, which benefits everyone who already owns property: the voters, the lenders, the big investors.
Why would you risk flooding the market and potentially lowering your own asset value?
You wouldn't. The system structurally rewards inaction in the face of rising demand.
That is a powerful synthesis. When you trace the journey, each individual step, it looked reasonable at the time.
Right. Selling council homes helps some people achieve homeownership.
Restricting council building kept public debt down. Private renting filled a gap.
But you take all those individual rational steps together.
And you've fundamentally shifted the entire housing system, from one centered on homes to one centered entirely on investments.
And that's the core takeaway for you, the listener. The system is now engineered to reward holding property value. And once we all start talking about houses like their stocks or bonds, our main concern becomes protecting their value,
Often at the expense of supply.
which makes new building a market risk. And this isn't really about individual moral failings or a single politician's mistake. It's about how systems behave when they're designed to reward holding more than building.
So, what does this deep dive mean for you, the listener, the next time you hear a debate about construction targets or rental caps? This framework, tracing these quiet policy shifts, it helps make all the arguments and the stalemates feel, well, a lot less mysterious.
You can see the tension.
Yes. When you hear that conflict, you now understand it's the fundamental tension between the societal need for shelter and the financial need to protect existing asset value.
They are two opposing forces.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If we keep optimizing and rewarding housing solely for behaving like a high-performing financial investment, what eventually happens to our fundamental, our emotional, our social idea of home along the way?